Well, next week will mark the 5-year anniversary of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 being shot down over eastern Ukraine. It was a senseless act of violence that killed all 298 passengers on board. For the families of the victims, it's been a long and torturous journey waiting for answers. Jane Malcolm lost both her mother and stepfather in the tragedy and has decided to speak out for the first time. Jane, thank you for speaking with us today. Tell us why you have wanted to speak out.
I don't know if I want to speak out. I feel compelled to speak out. I feel like if I don't speak, other people fill in the void. It's a very difficult thing to talk about, and I know it's a decision a lot of the MH17 families struggle with. I know a lot of people that didn't talk to start with and who now feel a responsibility to the family members they've lost to keep talking about it and to not let it be forgotten.
You feel ready now?
When it first happened, I was just in a daze.
It was one of the most confronting crimes of modern times. Scenes of utter devastation sending shockwaves around the world. With a futile push of a button, on the afternoon of the 17th of July 2014, a missile was launched from eastern Ukraine, bringing down a Malaysian Airlines jet, flight MH17. 298 innocent people were killed, including 38 Australians. Among them, fathers, mothers, children. Jane Malcolm's mother Carol and stepfather Michael were wrapping up the trip of a lifetime when they boarded that ill-fated flight. And it's a tragedy that's left Jane with far more questions than answers. So one of the reasons for talking today is you want to keep the memories of Carol and Michael alive. Tell us about them. Tell us more about your mum and your stepdad.
Both school teachers, both primary school teachers, actually. I don't think you could imagine two people less likely to end up in international news. I think I'd like them to be remembered as people who really dedicated their lives to other people, and because they did, not in a showy, flashy way, but just in a normal day-to-day way.
And so this was a trip of a lifetime.
Oh.
Neither of them had been to Europe before.
This was the overseas trip. They weren't planning to ever go that far overseas again.
Had there been any discussion or trepidation about flying Malaysia Airways?
Yeah, because this was after MH370. So everyone, as soon as you said Malaysian, everyone, I think, said the same thing. Definitely, I remember having that conversation, but you just think they're not going to lose two planes. And
the whole event is nonsensical. How do you wrap your head around it and come to that realisation of what's occurred?
I found out on the morning I woke up and saw that a plane had crashed. Social media or something, and I knew they'd been travelling at about that time, so I went looking, and it was on its way. Looked at the flight path and thought, that sounds familiar, and then I had their itinerary. I'm doing all this on my phone, trying not to panic, and it didn't have the flight number on there. I ended up, I looked on Wikipedia, who had a page set up, and they had all the flight details, like the scheduled departure time as well as the time it actually departed, and that's how I worked it out. There was a lot of phone calls back and forward. Eventually, my uncle had got through to DFAT, and he confirmed that was the flight that they were booked in on. And if you know my parents, they weren't going to miss a flight. They would have been there hours early, so we knew then.
Just hearing you describe that with the scramble to try and ascertain whether they were on the flight just leaves me with a knot in my stomach. I cannot begin to imagine what that process was like for you. It would have been torturous.
In my memory, I remember not knowing as being worse than finding out. Just, at least you feel like you're a bit in control when you know something horrible's happened.
But also to lose them in such horrific circumstances.
It wasn't until I rang my best friend and I told her that my mum and Michael, they were on that flight that crashed, and she just burst into tears straight away. And I think maybe started to settle in, but I was in shock for weeks, I think.
And to me, one of the most harrowing things is, on top of losing loved ones, not having them to bury, to lay to rest.
Yeah, Mum and Michael were sitting pretty much right where the missile hit. We didn't get a lot back to bury. It's not the hardest thing. The worst thing is that Mum and Michael have been murdered. That's the worst thing, is they're dead. But wouldn't wish it on anyone. I don't think I'd wish it on the people who did it.
You just mentioned that those who did it, when they were identified and we saw photos of them, did you have any thoughts or feelings about that?
I'd like for history to show what their names are and what they did. Me and all the other families that I've spoken to try not to get angry, because it ends up kind of weighing you down. But when you see the President of the United States, our supposed biggest ally, just trying so hard to get into Putin's good books, it's very, very difficult to watch that. Very difficult. I don't think there'll ever be a proper resolution to it, but I think I'll be okay.
Yeah, next year marks the 5-year anniversary. It's hard to believe, isn't it? 5 years have passed, and she's starting to find some light in her life, but it's just been an enormous shock and tragedy to have to live with.
Go on, Tom.
Oh, it was just incredibly powerful to see. You know, it's still, I know you say she starts to put the life back together, but it's still incredibly raw when you hear the details of particularly how they find out about these things, people that go through such tragedies. It's awful.
The media can sometimes move on from these stories and we forget these people are still dealing with this all the time. So she spoke beautifully.
She did indeed. Fabulous woman. Thank you again, Jane, for giving us your time and sharing your story.